Well, my name's Oscar Clark. I'm CEO of Fundamentally Games, and I'm basically looking at the strategy and the aspects of what makes a living game. And that's the purpose of this session. I took a kind of leaf out of the book of all sorts of different services. Talking about 12 steps. It's a 12-step program to LiveOps. Now, there are lots of arguments about whether the order is ideal. There are lots of different reasons. I ummed and ahed about the order of these elements. Hopefully they'll all make some sense, but the key thing is to look at each of these 12 steps if you're going to be successful at making your game go to live. Now, I'm going to try to make sure we're not just focusing on living games, so games with a long-term strategy, although there is going to be a bias towards those games. But I also hope that at the same time, even if you've got a game that's a one-off, that you probably aren't trying to make one-off games. You're probably not just trying to make one game and then you're done. You probably have a whole program of activities and live experiences you'd like to create, even if it's simple kind of one-off nuggets of narrative joy. They're fine, but you still have to think about the consequences, the shadow that they cast, and how you engage audiences in the long term, and that's what this is all about. So, anyway, that's a bit of a preamble. Let's kick off. So, what we're going to try and do, we're going to talk about the evil corporate plans to take over the universe. Oh, wait, no. So LiveOps isn't that. We're not evil. We're actually trying to produce ways of making games playable that are more enjoyable for everybody. That's really what this is all about. We're going to be able to sustain engagement and joy throughout the experience of the player. So, that's different from a product. A product is something which has an initial kind of purchase, and then it's done and consumed, and then it has a long tail. That's a classic product. Some people might be producing product-based experiences, and that's all fine. I mean, product-based experiences are perfectly okay, but typically a product will exist in the context of others. If you're making a game, you're probably going to make a bunch of games. It'd be good if you can to be able to make that bunch of games so that they can build off each other, so it can sustain a community of players over an extended period of time. And that's what we want to try and do, is to try and make sure that we can create a living experience, whether that is for one product or for a portfolio of products. So what does a service look like? A service looks like this. It looks like an extended experience where we're not just engaged at the point of the release of the content. We actually can create engaging material to boost and sustain a larger audience over time. And this service mentality has had a profound effect on almost every aspect of our lives. There's a reason why we're using tools like YouTube and Spotify. It's because they create these service experiences that sustain our engagement over the extended period. I probably kind of laboured the point. Let's simplify it. Let's break it down to the basics. We're talking about getting more players, doing more things, more often, and for longer. That's it. We're done. That's it. All over. Oh, wait, no. I should actually go through 12 steps. But my point is that it's not complicated. It's not, deep. It is simply looking at those things. More players, doing more things, more often, and for longer. Because we can then scale in 4 ways. It's not just about having a publisher who's going to spend lots of money in a big marketing campaign, put your game on the side of a SpaceX rocket to the moon. That's not going to get you long-term engagement, long-term play, long-term enjoyment. What's going to get you long-term play, long-term engagement, long-term enjoyment from your players is to invest in them. And that's where these 12 steps are going to come in. So, if everyone's happy, we'll go on to the first of those steps. So step 1, your life cycle is a funnel. Now, okay, what does that mean? That means that you're going to have players coming into your game, either because you've spent money to acquire them, you've got them to find you, you've done some social engagement, but they're going to come in and discover your game. That's great. We want that. But it doesn't end when they've discovered the game. It doesn't end when they decide to buy or not buy. We have to sustain and activate that community. They're going to go through stages where they're going to be learning about the relationship between you, them, and the game. And sometimes that's about understanding the controls. Other times it's more detailed than that. Other times it's actually about understanding where your games fit into their daily routine. Why are they going to expect this amazing thing that you're going to produce in X period of time? This idea of understanding the learning stage, that part where you bring people up to speed to consider themselves engaged with you and your game development team and your game titles. That engagement is the critical stage. That's the point where we can really start working with people, and hopefully we can convert some of them to paying as well. I mean, that's at the end of the day, we are making generally commercial products. I don't think there's anything wrong with asking people to pay for the effort, work, and so on and so forth, to the level that it's valuable to them. Our job, though, is not about converting people because they owe it to us. Our job is to provide them with value that they care about. People don't buy things because a few people might want to be nice, Patreon type stuff, and to pay. But actually, most people want value for what they buy. And we need to communicate that. We need to design that into the game. We need to be authentic about the way we do that. That's how we get conversion. If we do that well, we do that beautifully, people will super engage. And that super engagement becomes a kind of like, oh, look what you could be too. And that helps drive community. And in turn, the engaging users who are inspired and have this sense of desire, this momentum moving forward, derive further virality, which feeds back into your engagement. Now, this isn't unique to service experiences. It's just that with a service, our emphasis is after the sale, after the initial download, after the first engagement. If we are selling a product up front, we tend not to do that. We tend to just get you to the point where you buy, and that's it, we'll forget about it. Well, I'm saying you shouldn't be forgetting about it, even if you are selling a game up front. You should be thinking about what keeps them, what's going to make them come back in a year's time for the next game. How are you going to set up the expectation? How are you going to activate them so they tell other people about how amazing that game is? That's the stuff that we need to think about. So that's step one. Start looking at your game as a funnel, not as a product. Next is thinking about the persona, the types of people, the audience. Now, again, you could argue this should be first or second. I mean, in fact, the first three could arguably be any order. It'll be your personal approach to your game's business that will decide the order in which you look at it. But from a logical point of view, just starting with understanding your game as a funnel is a good step. Step two, thinking about who you're selling your game to. Basically, why should they care? Sorry, just a quick one. I just noticed a note here. Is it worth looking into customer success practice from enterprise? Yes, there is, but more as a philosophical principle rather than actual behaviour. So the question here really is about when you're looking at your game, your life cycle of your player as a funnel. That is literally taken from a B2B mindset. I literally kind of took that from that kind of experience, having done that a long time ago, and I've looked at how to apply that in consumer experiences as well, and something I've done for many, many years. In fact, there's a book called Jeffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm, which is used by a lot of B2B marketing people, which is absolutely applicable to B2C marketing and B2C engagement. By the way, if you don't know what B2B and B2C is, business to business, so this is trade, or B2C, business to consumer, i.e. to players. So when we as a business sell to players. So understanding these sales techniques is very useful. Similarly, you can look at strategic sales strategies, gatekeepers, influencers, and things like that. Now, that isn't a one-to-one match for the consumer world, for the players world. However, we are starting to see some parallels in the way that we're seeing the role of an influencer, where we're seeing the role of brands, of press, of reviewers, of leading figures, of community groups. So it's useful to be informed, but you can't just translate business practices to consumer experiences. Anyway. Hopefully that answered the question. So back to audiences. Again, this is part of the reason why you can't just take a business approach to a consumer marketing activity is because we're dealing with different types of people. We're dealing with different needs. We need to know what they think, feel, say, and do, because we need to understand them, because we want to know why should they care. And it's important to understand why they should care in the context of our game, in the reality of our game. And actually, there'll be different layers of our game that I would argue should be designed to maximize the interest of each of the different audiences. So I tend to use 3 personas. It's fairly common in marketing folks to use 3 personas. Persona is just really a kind of hypothesis, an idea of a person. So this is a conceptual, a stereotype of a person that we'll use to help decide how we're going to target our messaging, how we're going to talk to our audience. Because we're going to say, okay, so Ahmed is my primary player. He's exactly the person I'm thinking of. He's a young IT person who has all sorts of interest in competitive sports. Okay, I made that up. It's okay. We can make these things up to start. And okay, I didn't make it up entirely from nothing. I had some experience. I know my game. I know the kinds of people who play games like that, and I will tap into that. You'll also notice if you're not aware of what BC1C2D means, that's a shorthand. It's actually a classical form of demographic analysis that's used specifically in the UK. But it just basically means, are you from a professional background? Are you educated? Are you skilled? Are you are you unskilled labor? These are kind of shorthands for understanding some elements about they're actually useful in the UK in particular because there is a whole bunch of marketing data that you can use to tap into. So that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to paint a picture of who we think they are, our audience is, and where we can find them. We need to match that to the values that our game offers, because we need to know that that player is going to care about our game. In fact, we should be designing our game to make sure that we're satisfying a need that these players have. Now, quite often we don't do that, to be honest. Quite often we just leap in and say, oh, I'm going to make this game, and then think about who it fits. Now, arguably that's not the best way to do it, but from a design point of view, there is no right and wrong. However, we always need to think. Now, I've broken this down into layers of the game. I talk about the mechanic of the game, the structural mechanic. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. I talk about the context loop. By context loop, I mean the purpose and progression. Again, talk about that in a bit. And then I have a third layer, which is the metagame. That, for me, is not the game. It's the things around the game. It's the way that we interact around the game, like the social collaboration or competition, the zeitgeist moment that is created through play, that thing that you tell people, oh, did you see in this game, I just finished Days Gone and I was really frustrated by this, I really loved that. That social connection stuff isn't about the game. But if we don't pay attention to it, we don't know the context in which our game sits. We can't therefore message it properly in terms of our marketing communication. We can't engage players properly because we haven't understood it, why they care. And we can't make sure that we improve it because we don't have the context of what's working. So hopefully that makes sense. So what we're talking about is step 2 is understand the audience. And this technique of using 3 personas will make your life a lot easier. They start off as hypothesis, and then you build on that hypothesis over time. You build on your understanding until you get to the point where you can actually replace your hypothesis with real data. And then you know exactly what the typical person is who is your primary audience, what your typical person is for your secondary audience, and what your typical person is for your tertiary audience. Hopefully all that makes sense. Please feel free to message if there's any questions there. So I talked about layers in the game. This is my approach to things. You will have your own. But I find it extremely useful to think about the game in layers. I think about the core mechanic. So that's the start condition, the challenge, the resolution, and the reward. Now you'll notice the way I've drawn this, it's against 2 dimensions of emotion. I've got relief and tension, so that's kind of like She's Sent Me Out's flow, but I've also got anticipation and fear of missing out. And you'll notice my start condition is in the corner, which is in relief and anticipation. So I want to start restful, but looking forward. I want to face a challenge. My challenge should put me in a position where I'm still looking forward, but now I'm feeling the tension. Will I succeed? Can I do it? Am I capable? I've got some level of stress. That stress is positive if I'm still anticipating it. And then as I move from challenge to resolution, I'm now entering that space, which is fear of missing out. Because, if I don't achieve, I've got something I can lose. And that emotional journey I'm describing here is incredibly important, especially when you end up at reward. You'll notice reward might be in relief, but it's still in the fear of missing out. Why? Because I want you to do it again. I want you to have that sense that there's more to be had. And I think if we look at our designs through this lens, you'll find it's going to make it easier for you to have compelling loops. So by having a mechanic that drives the context forward, that drives the purpose, the progression, your optimization and your narrative, your personal and your game narrative, in that same framework with anticipation, fear of missing out on one dimension, and relief and tension in another dimension. Using this pattern, we can nail not just where the fun is, but what the user journey looks like and how we can sustain it over an extended period of time. Especially when we then add into that the third layer, looking at the metagame, the lifestyle fit. So how does this game work for me? If I'm on a mobile phone, a game that I can sit and play on the toilet in 5 minutes is probably a good lifestyle fit. Yes, I know it's probably a joke I've made far too many times, but it's actually true. If I'm waiting for a bus, the thing that I can be interrupted while playing is a good lifestyle fit. If I'm at home and I'm trying to spend the evening just chilling out, I find myself drawn to sandbox games. Like I say, just finished Days Gone. I'm hugely into things like Fallout 76. I know, Fallout 76 had a bad start, but once it became Game Pass, it's actually quite good. But they're things I can lose myself in. So I'm going to clear the room. Well, actually, my family sit in the room with me. They're doing things like YouTube on their phones. I've taken over the main TV screen. Those games fit my lifestyle. They work for me. And then the collaboration or competition, social aspects have an important part to play. But then the narrative has a transformative effect in the social context, because now it becomes a zeitgeist moment. This is where things like Fortnite become so important. We can have bands playing live in a world. I remember we had Dizzy Rascal playing in PlayStation Home back in the day, and now we see Fortnite with Marshmallow or whatever else. I mean, there's been a lot more since then, but the point is, again, understanding this balance of each stage and the emotional journey of the player, whatever model you use, is going to be really critical. That's what keeps the game live, because if we understand this, any configurations we do, any events we create, any promotions we offer will fit into the context of this repeatable pattern of play. Now, how does that apply to a product? It probably doesn't exactly, but you're going to have your game in a nice core structure. You've got to think about how it fits in the contextual process. Where is the lifestyle fit of your portfolio of games? Can you package your portfolio of games in a way which then fits into the idea of progression, or fits into the idea of collaboration, or fits into the idea of lifestyle fit? So understanding those principles, understand that even in a standalone static experience, you can still have to think about the player experience, the player's loops, really matters. Data, step 4. I cannot underestimate the importance and the significance of data in the last 10 years, if not 20 years, of game development. It has been, I think, the single most contributing factor to the increasing success of the games industry, and in particular demonstrated by the dominance we now have over mobile games. Now, remember, I'm old, and I was there back in the early days, 2003, when we launched 3's Java game platform. We were laughed at. Why would you want to play games on a mobile phone? Genuinely, I had that constantly. Now, don't get me wrong, it took things like the iPhone to come in, the app stores to come in, the kind of Android stores, the ability to integrate advertising, a lot of which we were playing with in the early days, but really only perfected after 2008. In fact, I'd argue really only came into force probably around 2015-16. I say that based on my time at Unity, when we were doing Unity ads around that kind of period, and that transition point for rewarded ads in particular. But data is what really drives that. The understanding of what happens, what people, how people respond at a fine detailed level is really important. Now, privacy concerns are really, really important. Security concerns are really, really important. In fact, literally the day I finished working officially at Sony was the day that the hacks happened on the Sony network. I wasn't there. I didn't have anything to do with it, obviously. But I am glad to say that PlayStation Home, the product I worked on, was the first product they brought back up on live. So understanding security really does matter. Making sure that you think about data privacy, data protection, that you do a data protection impact analysis, absolutely critical. Now, I have to say that as well, because we did some work for the Information Commission Office in the UK, who can fine you, I think it's something like 17 million euros or 7% of your global turnover, whichever is larger, if you breach not just the GDPR, but the age-appropriate design codes. And I bet most of the people in the room don't even know what the age-appropriate design code is. That particular code, and we did a talk about it a few months ago, that particular code means that we can no longer assume that a player is over 18. We have to assume that they are under 18. That has profound consequences on our corporate responsibility as game developers. But there's another aspect on data. An absolutely more critical aspect on data. Again, we're going to cover a bit more in detail later, but configuration, settings on the server side of your game is content. By being able to set all of the variables on the server side using tools like the PlayFabs, the Chilies, I think Unity's just announced an update to their process. Those tools allow us to set the kind of physics, the experience, even design maps live through data set on a server can transform how you can operate your game's business. It's absolutely critical. It's so much more sustainable if you design it well, but you have to design data into your game, whether it's configuration or through understanding what happens very early, so that you get useful information, you understand what you're tracking that information for, and you can justify that transfer, and that you're doing that securely and appropriately for privacy. You'll notice I'm not telling you how to, because that is a massive talk in its own right, and I think there's something on a knowledge base if you want to check that out. Okay, next up, step 5. KPI Driven Development. So traditional game development, I argue, is broken for live games. And I think it's broken generally. I think it's actually not good for products either. I think we need to rip up the rulebook and start again. The rulebook has traditionally said we need a first playable, we need a vertical slice, we need an alpha, we need a beta, we need a soft launch, we need a live. Sounds great, doesn't it? But what's the point? Yeah, sorry. Florin, I love you for saying that. Florin has just said in the chat, vertical slice, lol. The reason is, as Florin absolutely knows, there is no single definition of what the heck a vertical slice is. And in fact, most of the publishers that I still talk to describe vertical slice as one example of all the functionality that's going to be in the game. Please, shoot me now. Because you're basically saying spend all of the money designing all of the things that you may or may not find works before you know you've got an audience. That's insane. That's literally insane. We need to take a leaf out of the books of the hyper-casual market. I know, don't get me wrong, I know some people do not like hyper-casual games. That's okay. I'm not asking you to like hyper-casual games. I like some of them. It's okay. I'm happy to confess that. But what I love is their cost-driven approach. Don't build what you can't prove has an audience. This is a fundamental change in mindset and essential, not just for living games, but for any game where you're going to run it in live. Because I don't want to spend all my money, all this money I'm going to spend hours and weeks and months of my life begging for it from investors and having to prove to them that I'm going to be good for it. Well, why don't I give them some proof? Why don't I have some proof? And how do I do that? KPIs. That means I'm going to do and add a CPI test. I'm going to basically put my game out there as a trailer before I even build it. I'm just going to build a 30-second trailer. I'm going to get that tested. Is there an audience? Can I get less than 50 cents CPI or less than 50 pence CPI, depending on your chosen KPIs? Now, we tend to use 50 pence, but if we can get under 30, rock and roll, very happy. That can happen. That is on a trailer, 30-second trailer, which explains in a kind of like awareness, interest, desire, action. There are 4 kind of messages in 30 seconds. What it's going to feel like to play this game. What does the art style look like? It's got to be a gameplay focused experience because we're trying to compare one idea for a gameplay against another idea for gameplay. We're looking for which is the idea of gameplay that resonates most with an audience. And we can use Facebook really effectively for that because Facebook's we can spend tiny amounts of money. We can spend 150 quid, 3 days worth of £50 a day and compare, say, 4 experiences. We can have 2 games, 2 mechanics, 2 mechanic variants, 2 art variants. So imagine I've got 2 mechanic variants, 2 art variants of 1 game. That's 4 trailers I can run. I can immediately know which version of mechanic and art trailer works best. Amazingly powerful. But let's say I've done a bit more than that. Let's say I'm a bit further down the line. Let's say I've got, say, an hour's worth of gameplay. I could release that as if live on early access on Android or early access on Steam, or actually there's even better now, we can use playtest on Steam. Playtest on Steam is great, and I think there are similar techniques on Epic. I've not had a chance to use those yet in anger, but I'm a super fan of the way the new Steam stuff is working. So can we launch that game with our 30-second trailer and get people directly to that page and see how many people are still playing the next day? Because typically we're not going to see everyone spending the whole hour of play. If we've got a repeatable play, we'll see if they come back. And that's really the principle. Now, I had a question here about the 30-second trailer. When we haven't got a game, we build just enough of gameplay in an engine to show off what the gameplay could look like. We're talking about game jam level development. We talk about using assets of the asset store. We're talking about building just enough gameplay to show its idea in a 30-second trailer. And frankly, you'll be amazed how little gameplay footage you need to make that really convincing. Especially when you think about the UI layers. I said UI layers or UX flow, any concept art that we can use to develop that, all of that kind of stuff makes a 30-second trailer really straightforward to pull together. Okay, so we've done our 30-second trailer. We've then done an hour's worth of gameplay, and we've pushed that live or semi-live into an early access or a playtest context. We've now got an idea of what our day one retention looks like. If I can get 40% day one retention, rock and roll. And that's not just mobile. I mean, it's a bit more complicated on PC, particularly paid upfront games. Paid upfront games are a much more problematic thing because paid upfront games provide a level of momentum in their own right. You've already filtered out the people who are only partially interested by making them pay. You have to be pretty committed to pay. Once you've paid, you want to justify your spend was worthwhile. So paid games will always have a higher day one retention, but we want to sustain that retention over much longer periods of time. So that's why it's important to understand what kind of game is promoting or not. But let's get these KPIs out there. Let's make it work. Let's work. Let's do some user testing groups. Let's use tools like Playtest Cloud, or let's use Antidote. Let's find other mechanisms. Keymeta are doing some amazing stuff. G-Round, so Global Top Rounds testing platform G-Round is out there. Keymeta are doing some really interesting stuff with playtesting. Let's get real people playing it. Let's see what the numbers look like. At each stage of these KPIs, we can test, we can test, we can test, we're going to do some more investment, more development. What do we need to get to the next stage? Let's use the data that we can get to inform what we do next, not our personal opinions. Yes, we want our personal opinions too, because it's data plus our personal experience is what gives us insight. But we're building based on the idea of, can we get the retention numbers right? So day 1, day 7, day 14, day 30. And then the important one, ROAS, return on advertising spend. Because if we can prove that the game can generate revenue, we can invest in that game to market it. Why would you spend a ton of money marketing a game until you know that you get a return? Surely you should optimize it to get the best out of the return before you spend the big bucks. So, anyway, all of this kind of stuff is really interesting. And again, I love all that, using third-party tools like that. Brainwave's great, fine. Personally, I found that using skin sensors, alpha waves, all this other stuff is useful, but the level of extra value it gives you compared to a user test group that's recorded is marginal. It's useful. If you can get it, you can afford it, fantastic, but it can get in the way as much as it can help. But my point, my step 5 was very much about this. Let's move away from the traditional milestone model where we can. If you have a publisher insisting on it, there's nothing you can do about it. That's life. But we've stopped doing traditional milestones. We instead focus on measures that are not our opinion, that are our opinion of players and what they actually do. Live is all about integrating steps. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these, well, some of the key parts of this. But if you think about going from launch is getting you through these stages, going to live is hitting a process. Live is a process. It's an integrated series of things that we do repeatedly, consistently, predictably to be successful. So what are events? These are the things that drive our engagement. That, yes, at the biggest scale, it's the big, esports. Most of us on this call are never going to have a game that we've made become an esport. It's a very outlying thing. Most of us aren't going to have Dizzy Rascal turning up in our game and showing off their game, or Marshmallow, or whatever. Although it's very nice when it happens, trust me. Some of us are going to be focusing on things like Christmas or Halloween. The Halloween is, I think, by far and away the best event of all in the calendar. But why not Star Wars Day? What about our own in-game lore? Why can't we create moments of competitive play between factional groups that drives the next month's narrative? What if you break your team, your community into red, yellow, and blue teams, and see which one collects the most monsters? And then that team is then incorporated as the biggest monster capturing clan in the next month's event, which gives that team some advantages in some areas and some disadvantages in others, and the other team's advantages in others, blah, 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 blah. Now we've really integrated the experiences over time. But events can be daily, they can be weekly, and they can be monthly. Ideally, they will be directed at creating an ongoing sense of experience and desire to keep playing. They should be valuable, repeatable, and importantly, configurable without having to update the app. Without having to resubmit the actual executable. It should be server configured. It should be then communicated on social channels inside the game and outside the game. It should be incorporated into your messaging for your user acquisition for any paid or influencer-led activities. Events should be cool. It should be exciting. You should look forward to. You should be wondering what next month's theme's going to be and excited when it's revealed. That's the stuff that matters. Promotions is where we turn that into revenue. Now, if you're doing a product, your promotions are going to probably be bundles of games, there might be discounts, there might be Steam sales. But inside the game, when we're running a living game, we can be more precise about that. We can offer specific activities that are specifically designed appropriate to the experience of the play. It could be bundles that are specifically around the mission and the live events. There could be any number of things. But they should be memorable. And most importantly, they should be meaningful. I'm actually not a fan of gems and coins. I don't really care about the how many gems I've got. What I care about is what I use them for. So having these big bundle offers is functionally useful, but it's not what I call a promotion. A promotion is when I get excited about, I'm going to get this discounted version and I'm going to get this amazing unique skin that's only available this month and it's going to stop being available in 2 days' time. That's the promotion. Buy one, get one free. Limited time offer. Where's the fear of missing out? Where's the excitement? Where's the anticipation? Where's the personal player value? And a lot of games get a bad rep as services because they forget that it actually matters what players love. Features. Now, the important thing about features and the difference between content and features is features require programmers. You are going to have to update a living game with new features. It's one of the key differentiators between a product and a service is that we have new features. Now, if you're making product, your feature is probably the next game, although you might have to update a game, particularly as engines change, as back-end services update, as store platforms update. You'll probably still have to invest in tech debt. That's okay. But you probably want to take a leaf out of the book of someone like No Man's Sky and make that update exciting. But the important thing is to make it predictable. You want people not to just sit in there. You're wasting so much power, you're so many opportunity if you only release it when it's needed. If instead you make sure you are predictable about when you're going to update and you deliver on that promise, that sustains excitement. And actually why living games are living is because we show the community that we're still engaged with that game. That game still has purpose and meaning. So much so, we're still building it. In fact, I go even further. One of the best things as a product owner for a living game, frankly, is that I can kill features without having to ever actually kill them, because I can always defer a feature to the next release. And the number of things that my darlings that I really wanted to make but I could never justify, just never appear in the build. That's okay. In fact, it's actually a good thing to defer things till later, because if we try to fit everything into launch, we're going to have too much. We'll have no story to tell next month or the month after or the month after. And if we can actually reduce the scope before we launch and still have an intrinsically enjoyable experience, we have a better game. So that was just step 6. We got a lot more to go, and I'm going to try and rush through them because I don't want to miss out. I kind of alluded to this earlier about the importance of data, but I'm going to go into more detail here, which is that content is data and players. So what is a collection? A collection is assets we've produced, sure, but also I can tick off the boxes of all the things that I've got. If I have a set and I complete it, there's an immediate satisfaction of that, and that completion is a data point. Progression, I am motivated to invest in my character partly because of the progression of that character over time. Well, that's just data points. So what you're selling to somebody is an improvement, incremental improvement in their data points. How you drive that, how you make that exciting and enjoyable, that's a different story. But at the end of the day, you as a developer need to think about the data component as well. And think about the player enjoyment. The player wants to show off their enjoyment of the game if you create a game that they love. Well, that's why having collections of outfits are really interesting, because that's an expression. So understanding the player component of each of the things that you offer as content is really important. And that is their personal journey in the narrative. It's the way that they choose to optimize from the choices that they've got to get the best outcome. It's the way they share that information. What I love about games like Magic the Gathering is that no matter how many times Wizards talk about there's no single dominant strategy, you will find a dozen websites telling you the definitive dominant strategy in the game, even though we know it's not one. The more ambiguity we can put in, the more enjoyment the players get out of discerning that ambiguity and coming up with their solution. That itself becomes deeply engaging. So optimization should never be underestimated. But at the end of the day, other players are a massive, massive draw. Now, personally, I play massively single-player games, generally. What does that mean? It means I'm antisocial and I play online nowadays. I used to be loving getting into my first-person shooters, but I've never been very good at them. I'm just a bit dyspraxic. But equally, I used to love playing massively online, MMOs and things like that. But nowadays, I will play sandboxes. I will play No Man's Sky, and I don't want to talk to anybody. Even though I'm massively sociable when it comes to my day job. But I just want to play games to relax nowadays. But if there wasn't the possibility of other players, that game has no interest to me. We want a common shared experience, and that's why that's so important. So think about that. The next thing is think about community. Community is life in games. Living games in particular, but even products. So community is massively important. The positives of community are that we can tap into the community desires, or understand what they think, what they feel, what they say, what they do, and build expectations around that. We can build awareness, not just through the marketing that we do, but the community itself want to share the thing that they love with the people that they love. And if we don't show them love, we won't have that success. And I mean authentic. I'm not talking about lip service, having a swanky community manager who happens to use all the right words and is down with the kids or whatever. I mean, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about people who love your game, who are engaged in your game, who love your players and engage with your players, who want to excite and delight them. We have to be very wary, of course, though, of frustration. That means we have to be responsive. We also have to be very wary of toxicity. Being involved with projects where death threats have been made. And that is not acceptable. I've been involved with projects where language is used, sort of classical QuakeNet style kind of harassing language, which started out as kind of laddish one-upmanship that has become quite a toxic context. And the reality is that we just have to cut it out. We cannot accept toxicity because it doesn't do any good for anybody. So we've developed a lot in our understanding of community and how to manage it and how to engage with it, but we have to do it through authenticity and through genuine passion and love. And if you are not paying attention to your community, whether you're a product or a service, you will not be successful. So step 8 is community. Step 9, Columbo. Okay, I think some of you will have heard me say this before. I will say it again. It bears considering. The best TV show ever made is Columbo. Why? Well, okay, it's not me saying that, by the way. That was Stephen Fry, the British comedian and writer and polymath. But the reason he says it and other people say it is this. Columbo was a 1970s murder mystery where you saw the murderer commit the murder at the beginning of the show. So it's a whodunit where you know who did it. And you still watched it. The reason you watched it is because you weren't watching the murderer, you were watching the detective, the same character that you had seen time and time and time and time and time again, and thought you understood. But he's batshit crazy. Well, that's not fair. He's just very odd. And what you're trying to do is observe what Columbo does and work out from what he does how he solves the murder before the immortal words, just one more thing. He always says this at the end of the show, just 5 minutes before the end of the show. So you've got a game to play to work out how he solves it before he tells you how he solves it. And the interesting thing about that is that it's predictable that it's coming, but also, if you're right, you feel delighted because you were right. If you are wrong, you feel delighted because you learned something you missed. This is the metaphor for living experiences, whether you are talking about running a game as a LiveOps service or you're talking about building a portfolio of content. Predictable surprise pays off. You know it's coming. You deliver on your promises, so you are trustworthy, and yet you still surprise. That is what we're trying to do. That is possibly the most important thing about running a game in live, is understanding that. So I'm going to do a bit more practical stuff. So how do you sustain a living game without breaking your team? And the way I would recommend, through my experience, is to split your features and content into two. Content is stuff that doesn't need a coder. Features are stuff that does. Come up with 3 themes, 1 per month, or if you're going to do longer than quarterly, then you can do less themes. But in principle, 1 theme a month. Work out what content you're going to release in week 1. That's also available in week 2, but new content is available in week 2. So you're building up layers of content. Week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, whatever the rest of the time for that particular month is. We build up from 25% of the content to 50% of the content to 75% to 100% of the content, and then we're going to take it away. And then we repeat that each month. That form of structure is really useful, especially where you can find templates that you can easily reproduce without huge work on your art team, but that are genuinely flexible, genuinely unique. You want to create tools that allow you to create great content that isn't just cookie cutter, but efficiently. That's the trick. You want great content. It can't just be cookie cutter, but you also have to find ways to repurpose, ways to re-engineer, tools to facilitate the delivery of that content as easily and safely and authentically as possible. That's why setting up configurations for events that can be set on the server that affect the physics, the speeds, the fuel, the armor, the damage, the monsters, the look, the asset. That's why good content management systems are going to be really important to you, assuming you're running a live game. This is not as important with product. But with features, which I think still applies for some elements of this will still apply for product. Every quarter you should be putting a third of your time into tech debt. There will be a dozen SDKs, APIs, middleware things that will have to be updated. It's just going to happen. You also need to dedicate about a third of your time making sure you're constantly thinking about improving the user flow. You need to look at the data of what people actually do in the game. You look at the data and what they actually buy and how you promote the things that they buy in the game. You look at the data of the events and activities that they engage with and how you improve the messaging, communication of that. The UX flow is really critical, which means you've only got a third left. And you want to produce 3 features. And I say this to remind you that the number of features that we can actually release each month in live are tiny. Tiny. We have a month in a quarter to deliver 3 features. That's going to affect the way you think about the design and ongoing nature of your game. Nearly there, nearly there. This is another thing that people forget about with live experiences. And actually, if you're running portfolio product and you're running multiple products, the same principles apply. Which is basically thinking about your product. Now, I've gone quarter ones, but it could be months, it could be whatever. I'm just giving you an indication. So design starts first. Design then unlocks development. Obviously, there's a bit of overlap. Art and development, I'm assuming in this experience, is running in parallel. That may not always be the case. Then once they're delivered, you're going to test. And then once the testing is complete, you can go live. That's the sort of classical flow. That's a classical waterfall, if you like. But then we've got quarter 2. Notice that by the time we're doing design work for quarter 2, we have not got live yet. We've got no real data yet. In fact, we've barely got data from our testing. And yet we're going to go into developing our second quarter worth of work without having all of that information. That matters. That's a problem. Next, we're going to go into design for quarter 3. Now we have actual data from Q1, but not live data. Yeah, still not got live data. We're going into dev for the Q3 at the point where we still don't have live data incorporated in the designs as we go along. And again, this is really just to illustrate. Understand your pipeline. You cannot do crunch and have a good solid portfolio or good solid live ops strategy. You have to understand that you're going to be semi-blind to what people really want unless you're very, very, very careful. So you want to do as much testing analysis as early as possible. That's why the KPI driven approach is so important, because then you bring all of that information into your design process as early as possible. But also, you can't have your designers sitting there idle waiting, because it's going to have a knock-on effect of when your developers and artists can get on with their work, and that's going to have a knock-on effect of when your QA people are going to work on their part. You've got to think about your flows. You've got to think about your pipeline, because you need to be able to continuously deliver. Again, this is possibly my favorite slide. Why have I got Pillsbury and NASA on a slide? If you've seen this before, you'll know. Apologies for repeating it. But Pillsbury and NASA created a process called HACCP to feed the astronauts of the Apollo missions, because you can't test food that's going into a spaceship. Why? Because the moment you test it, you break the seal, it's no longer secure. It can go off. I need to know that the food isn't going to go off when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin rip open the packet. So in order to do that, they worked through that they had to work out their pipeline to get the food safely to the astronauts whilst they were on that 3-day transit to the moon, however long it took. So to do that, they had to do the following. They had to identify what hazards could happen. Things like mold, things like metal that could fall off machinery into the packaging, things like that. Then they had to work out where the control points were. Where were the things in that process they could actually make a difference? Where was metal likely to fall in? Do you test for metal at the start of a conveyor belt, or do you do the metal test at the end of the conveyor belt? Well, you do it at the end, because metal could fall in to the packaging any point along the conveyor belt up to the end. No point in testing before that. You tested at the end. What is this acceptable limits for the test that you're going to do? How do you correct it? Then you review the process and implement the changes. Now, the point is this. We have a similar need. We need to identify the hazards. In our case, it's not just hazards, i.e. reasons why people churn, but it's also the positives, the things that people love. We need to identify what they are. We need to identify where in the experience we can manage that. And often that's in gameplay data, but it might also be in CPI, so the cost per install. It might be in the number of engagements we get on our social media. It might be the number of organic installs we get. We need to look at how we can measure that. Well, we can measure the variables that affect those things. We need to know what normal, what good looks like. And then we need to be able to make corrective procedures. Triaging. Understanding your P1, P2, P3, P4, P5. We have P6 for various SLA, service level agreements. We agree how we're going to triage problems. We know what problems need to be escalated immediately. If it's service affecting, we need to know what that looks like. We need to know what data points are above or below or on target with what we consider to be acceptable. What is your server outage time frame? These are things that you need to think about. You need to think about your DevOps, whether you're running DevOps personally or using a platform like, I don't know, Dominion or something like that to do it for you. You need to understand how much time your server is going to be down. If Amazon are agreeing, 95% availability, planned availability, they could have planned downtime that could be days. They could have actual downtime, which is days. Can your game be down for days? What are you going to do about it? And yes, this is QA 101 to a large extent as well. It's kind of a bigger picture than QA, because the intention with HACCP is that you don't just look at what's going on in the game. You also look at how you're testing. And you review the very process of this as well as the individual aspects of it. So this is actually, whilst it's called hazard analysis and critical control points, and whilst it's designed for the food industry, I think it's a massively useful way of looking at continuous process improvement. And that is my point. Live is not actually about having servers. Live is about having a systematic approach to continuous improvement. Ahmed, no problem. I nearly done as it happens anyway. I have one bonus step before I quit, and that is love your player. That to me is the thing I think that we always forget to say. You know, we don't talk about fun enough. We don't talk about loving the game. We don't talk about loving the player. You know, we have to have a love for live. Whether we're creating a portfolio of products or whether we're running a live experience service game, we need to show love for that live and make sure that functions and gives value to players. So, I think that's me done. There's a question here. TMMI. There's a lot of information in this guy. TMMI. Who's that? Sorry, you have to explain that one. I'm not sure. I probably know who it is once you've outlined the acronym. But yes, there's a whole bunch of measures and qualities. At some point, maybe I should do a webinar on SLA, service level agreements. As a publisher, we think it's important to have one, particularly because we're a LiveOps publisher. And that is a contract between you and the developer about the speed of response that you think is acceptable to the player. So when you're going to report problems, how quickly you're going to respond to players who report problems, how quickly you're going to escalate problems to who and under what circumstances, how you're going to monitor so that it's not just about the players reporting to you when a problem occurs. All of those things really matter. Another technique that's really useful, a separate additional thing, is a pre-mortem. So a pre-mortem is basically you sit down with everybody before you launch the game and say, okay, what's going to go wrong? You start off with the assumption that the game has failed, and you step backwards and say, okay, the game has failed, what do we do next? And then you identify where you think those problems could happen, you explore that, and that kind of future forward thinking is really powerful. Really helps make sure that you are ahead of problems before they happen. There will still be problems. There will still be surprises. That is live. However, you'll be more prepared than if you just go in blind. Okay, so that has been our webinar. I hope you found that useful. We will be sharing slides and the link to the YouTube version of this shortly. We'll also do a Ask Me Anything between 1 p.m. and 3 p.m. on Friday, this Friday, on our Discord channel. I will be making sure we send out to you the slides and details, connection information for that later. Testament. I don't know that model, so thank you for that. I will have to check that one out. If anyone has any questions for me, then please feel free to post. But hopefully I've given you a good sense of like 12 things that you need to pay attention to and grab hold of. And, you know, feel free to check through the slides if you have any questions later as well. Okay. Anyone else have any questions or thoughts? If not, I think we are to time. I'm happy to hang on for a little longer if anyone needs to, but otherwise, thank you very much for joining us. This has been your webinar for for the 12 steps of LiveOps. Yes, and the question I just had asked was the book I mentioned earlier. It's called Crossing the Chasm, called by Geoffrey Moore. That is correct. In fact, my book, Games and Service, is kind of like a heavily influenced by that, and also by the Lean Startup, and lots of Raf Costa and all this other stuff as well. So I'm a big fan of that book. Cool. All right then. So I think we're done. Unless anyone has any questions, I'm going to say thank you very much and goodbye.